Hi, it's Paul from howtonetwork.net. So we're going to cover, it's a beginner's level subject really, foundation stuff, quite useful if you're new to Cisco CCNA, not too confident maybe navigating the Cisco iOS. I mean, the reason is many people have done Microsoft certifications or other things which involve using a graphical user interface. Using the Cisco iOS, it's a bit like using Linux or the old-fashioned DOS, Windows DOS, where it's not particularly user friendly on the face of it. So this is why the exam is harder, and also why Cisco engineers do tend to be paid more than other IT engineers and specializations, because it's harder to get through the exams. So we're going to be covering a few different things. One of the main things is we're going to be looking at overall, obviously, the Cisco iOS router modes. Excuse me, I'm from the UK, so we say router, you say router. Well, I'll say router to keep you happy if you're in America. Different router modes, keyboard shortcuts, how we can make life a little bit easier. And not only that, but Cisco do tend to ask exams about these different types of modes and navigating your way around the commands in the exam, and they're easy marks. Error messages, the most common couple of error messages you'll see, and how not to be put off by them. The other thing we're going to look at is navigating around the interfaces. This is one thing that the new Cisco students tend to find the hardest really, is working their way around to the correct mode to start putting the correct command in. A few little tips that will make life easy for you using Cisco iOS, and then what to do if you've typed something and you don't want it on the configuration anymore. How do we deal with that? So we're going to go into our router dialog first. What I'll do is I'll just turn the router off, back on, and then we have, this is known as our command line interface, our CLI. So the image you'll see is self-decompressing. It's compressed into memory and decompressed. And then you'll see something similar to what we can see now. Continue with configuration dialog. Yes or no. This is basically going to asking you if you want to go into setup mode, and this is mistake number one that I see new Cisco students make, and they made it a lot of times when I was teaching the Cisco CCNA course in the UK. The student would type yes here and then get asked a lot of questions, yes or no questions, or fill in the blanks to type in, and then the router would try and configure itself. It's never been a very popular way of configuring routers, and if a person wanted to use an easier way, there's actually a GUI called Security Device Manager, which we'll talk about later. But whenever you get asked this question, as far as we're concerned, you'll type the letter N or no. I'll just type the letter M, and then it's saying press return to get started. So hopefully if you're watching this video you're familiar with the return key. And we're presented with the first mode. This mode is called user mode, and we recognise it because of the greater than key. This is fairly useless to us as Cisco network engineers. The one purpose of this command, if we ever wanted to use it, we'll cover security later in another lecture, but you may want to give a junior member of the network or somebody on help desk level 1 access to the router and just be in user mode. You've got a very limited set of commands to be able to use here. The way to see which commands you do have access to is to hold down the question mark, press enter, and it will say the commands you have available. We don't really need to worry about all of these, to be honest. I just want to point out the fact that we've just got some very basic commands. So you can see you can tell it to another device. You can issue a show command, which we'll be talking about. Show commands are a very powerful tool for you configuring the router and also for troubleshooting, and there's a certain key amount of show commands that you need to know, and I'll be covering some of the basics. So the first thing we've learned here, or the second thing really, first thing is we're in user mode with the greater than. The second thing is to use the question mark, and that will give us some information. We're going to be coming back to the question mark shortly, and I've certainly used it an awful lot, and I still do sometimes if I'm not sure if it's a certain line of config that I haven't used very often or haven't even used before maybe, or Cisco have added a new functionality. type the question mark. The other thing is, in the CCNA exam it should work. The question mark feature should work. Some people say it doesn't, but from my own experience, it does work. Alright, so as a network administrator, we'll want to get into a more powerful feature set of commands on the Cisco iOS. And you can see the one command here that we're allowed to use is enable. Now, enable mode I'll cover later in security. It must be protected with a password, a secret password, but we won't worry about that at the moment. So enable. The other thing I'd like to mention before we go into enable mode is, if the only command available starts with the letters you're going to type, then the Cisco iOS will recognise that that's the command. I couldn't have the letter E and then press enter because you can see there's two commands here starting with the letter E. So I'll need to type EN at the very least. Now, you're allowed in the exam also to use certain abbreviations, the most common ones. If it doesn't work for whatever reason, then please just go back to the longer version. We have now left user mode and we're in privilege mode. You'll know you're in privilege mode because we have the pound sign here. Some people call it the hash, but generally it's universally called the pound sign. So now we're in privilege mode. In privilege mode, it's far more powerful. If I type the question mark now, I've got one page of commands here, and we've got other pages. The way to scroll up through all the rest of the commands, if I press the enter key, it will just show me the next command. If I press the space bar now, where it says more, it will show me all of the other commands on the next page. And sometimes you can have several pages of commands or features. So let's do that again. I'll press the question mark, press enter, and you can see all of these commands. Don't worry, you don't need to know all of these, by the way, but the thing you do need to know is how to get to these commands here. For example, if you know you're in privilege mode and you wanted to go into configure mode, it's very useful to know that you're in privilege mode first in order to get to the configure mode. For example, if you're in if we type exit here, now we're back in user mode. So if I try and type config here, for example, the router doesn't know what I'm talking about, and it's doing something called a DNS lookup. It's sending a broadcast packet across all of the network, trying to find a device that's called config. Now I'll show you in a while how we can turn that command off, but for the moment it's something that's a real nuisance, but I'll show you how to do that. So remember, or do you remember the command to get us into privilege mode? Well, if you said it was enable, you'd be correct. Okay, so we've gone into our first mode. One of the keys to progressing as quickly as possible as a new Cisco engineer is to work out which modes do what and how to navigate between the modes. So privilege mode I mentioned has got some very powerful features. For example, you can go into config to configure something. You can type a show command, and there's a whole host of show commands there for you to look at and do some troubleshooting with. But the next thing I wanted to show you was how to drill into a subdirectory of a mode. So we're in privilege mode and we want to get into config mode. So I'll type config. Now press the space bar, and if I type question mark, the router is going to give me the options that I have available after the command config. Well, the only one available we can see at the moment is config terminal, which basically means configure this terminal session, so we can configure the router. Now if I type config and just press enter, the router will say, well, which one is it? Do you want to configure from terminal? Do you want to configure the memory or network? Really, the only thing you'll ever use is config T.